Oh, it turns out dimming the lights is the most effective way to sort of calm the conversation. So good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2025 Warren K. Lewis Lecture in Chemical Engineering at MIT. And before I introduce our honored lecturer for this afternoon, I would like to say a few words about the person for whom this lectureship is named. Doc Lewis, as he was affectionately known by his students and associates, had an enormous impact on shaping this program and the field of chemical engineering as a whole. Doc entered MIT in 1901, where he first met William H. Walker, head of the Course-10 program in chemical engineering that then resided within the Department of Chemistry. He received his PhD in physical chemistry from the University of Breslau, Germany in 1908. By the way, since I gave the speech last year, I actually received a physical copy of Doc Lewis's 1908 dissertation written in German. It is in headquarters if anybody wants to come by and see it. You can't have it, but if you would like to come by and see it, let me know. It's really marvelous. Doc joined MIT as an assistant professor in 1910 and was promoted to professor in 1914. He was the first head of the newly formed chemical engineering department after it fully separated from chemistry from 1920 to 1929. Lewis revolutionized the design of chemical engineering equipment with the concept of unit operations, the first paradigm of chemical engineering. He was an eminent researcher and inventor. He contributed much to the field of industrial chemistry with over 80 patents to his credit. As one example, he pioneered the use of fluidized bed catalytic cracking in refining. This is a picture we always like to show that really emphasizes Doc Lewis's role as a superb educator. His text, Principles of Chemical Engineering with Walker and McAdams in 1923, first defined the discipline. His lectures were legendary for the combination of beautifully organized material and Socratic exchanges with his students. Doc Lewis was recognized in a series called Great Teachers, featured in a special issue of Life magazine that was published on October 16, 1950. He was one of only 8 professors named, and they were all chosen by then college students. Not surprisingly, Lewis won many awards, among them the President's Medal of Science, the President's Medal of Merit, and the Priestley Medal from the American Chemical Society. As the most fitting honor, our professional society, AICHE, has honored him with the creation of the Warren K. Lewis Award, which recognizes outstanding education in chemical engineering. Following his term as department head, he devoted himself to teaching, research, and consulting, and remained an influential member of the department until his death in 1975 at the age of 92. The Warren K. Lewis Lectureship was established at MIT in 1978 to recognize Professor Lewis's revolutionary impact on chemical engineering. By developing the concept of unit operations first proposed by Arthur D. Little and William Walker, he revolutionized the design of chemical engineering processes and equipment. Throughout his career, Professor Lewis was mindful of the needs of industrial practice, so accordingly, this Lewis Lecture features speakers from industry and from academia. And now it's my pleasure to introduce this year's Lewis Lecturer, Professor Juan Pablo. Professor Pablo is NYU's inaugural Executive Vice President for Global Science and Technology and the Executive Dean of the NYU Tandon School of Engineering. He leads cross-university, multidisciplinary, and globally focused efforts to accelerate the momentum of NYU's vast science and technology enterprise for the purposes of solving humanity's largest challenges. Dovetailing with those efforts, Professor Pablo steers Tandon's engineering research and education to play a central role in addressing a multitude of areas, from human health to advances in materials discovery to the sustainability of the planet. Before joining NYU, Professor Pablo served as the Executive Vice President for Science, Innovation, National Laboratories, and Global Initiatives at the University of Chicago. That was a lot of jobs in one title.
And that's why I left.
He was also the Liu Family Professor in Molecular Engineering at Chicago's Pritzker School of Molecular Engineering and a senior scientist at Argonne National Lab. Prior to that, he served as the Howard Curler Distinguished Professor and Hilldale Professor of Chemical Engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was a postdoctoral researcher at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, also known as the ETH, in Zurich, Switzerland. A prominent materials scientist and chemical engineer, Professor Pablo's research focuses on polymers, biological macromolecules such as proteins and DNA, glasses, and liquid crystals, and canoes, we learned yesterday. He is a leader in developing molecular models and advanced computational approaches to elucidate complex molecular processes over wide ranges of length and time scales. He's developed advanced algorithms to design and predict the structure and properties of complex fluids and solids at a molecular level, and has been a pioneer in the use of data-driven machine learning approaches for materials design, and you can see that as the subject of his talk today. He's the author or co-author of well over 650 publications and a textbook on molecular engineering thermodynamics. He holds more than 25 patents, one of which has been deemed critical to the semiconductor industry's miniaturization goals, and one of which is now used throughout the world to stabilize proteins and cells, including probiotics, in glassy materials over extended periods of time. His many honors include the Polymer Physics Prize from the American Physical Society in 2018, the DuPont Medal for Excellence in Nutrition and Health Sciences in 2016, the Intel Patterning Science Award in 2015, and the Charles Stein Award from AICHE in 2011. In 2016, he was inducted into the National Academy of Engineering for the design of macromolecular products and processes via scientific computation. In 2022, he was inducted into the National Academy of Sciences. He's also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Physical Society, the Royal Society of Chemistry, and he's a foreign correspondent member of the Mexican Academy of Sciences and the European Academy of Sciences. Among other distinctions, he's delivered the Lacey Lectures at Caltech, the Dodge Lectures at Yale, and the National Science Foundation's Mathematical and Physical Sciences Lecture. He's chair of the Mathematical and Physical Sciences Advisory Committee of the National Science Foundation and the Committee on Condensed Matter and Materials Research at the National Research Council. He's also the founding editor of Molecular Systems Design and Engineering and served as Deputy Director of Science Advances and Physical Review Letters. He served as the co-director of the NIST Center for Hierarchical Materials Design from 2013 to 2024. And so we always like to have some photos of our speaker in his natural habitat. And these are the ones that we chose for Professor Pablo, which include, if you go clockwise, being welcomed to NYU. He's been there for a short time, but has already had a large impact. In the middle, it shows a picture of him with the NYU, the School of Engineering's admissions and enrollment team. And he posted this to LinkedIn, really recognizing the students who work there. So you can see he's very committed to education, describing the student employees as ones who embody the spirit of what it means to be here at Tandon and pursuing their own ambitions while playing a vital role in helping the next generation of engineers find their home here. There's a picture on the far right of him presenting the MSDE, so the journal that he founded, the inaugural prize for Best Emerging Investigator paper. That was presented to Andrew Ferguson, who was in our department as a postdoc with Arup Chakraborty. That was at the 2018 Frontiers of Molecular Engineering Conference. You can see him all dressed up to give the University of Chicago's convocation address in 2016. And then the last picture there, you may recognize Governor Pritzker from the 2020 Chicago Quantum Summit discussing the impact of quantum research. Hopefully you could tell from the introduction that we have a very distinguished guest from us. You can tell from the quip he gave to me that you're in for a treat, for a delightful presentation, and so it's really my honor and pleasure to turn the mic over to Professor Juan Pablo.
Thank you. And I think we have time for a few questions left from the... Thank you, Krista. It is a real pleasure to be here today, especially these times when you see that we're honoring the memory of somebody who did foundational work over 100 years ago. And we continue to think of him and his contributions in our community. It reminds us that all of this hardship that we're seeing right now is transitory. What matters is what we did, what we think, the fields that we define, the questions that we answer, and the people that we educate. So happy to be here. MIT is also a very special place for me. I don't think there's another school in which I have so many former students or collaborators or friends or mentors all in one place. I look at the audience and I see all of you. All of you have helped me become who I am, for better or for worse. And it's just a true joy to be here, so thank you for inviting me. So what I thought I would do today is tell you about some of the work that we're doing on trying to design new polymeric materials. We're at a time where we'd like everything to be more sustainable and recyclable and upcyclable. And to do that, increasingly, we're turning to models and artificial intelligence to help us design things quicker, faster, and better. So the problem that we're trying to address right now is summarized in this picture that you see over here. On the upper left, you see the production of polyolefins increasing at the tune of hundreds of thousands of tons right now. And the reason that this production is increasing is that those materials are incredible. We can control the branching, the crystallinity, the mechanical strength, and we can produce all of those materials at a very, very cheap price. We'd like to come up with sustainable alternatives that we can easily recycle, that perform exactly the way that polyolefins do, and at a cost that is actually comparable, competitive with that of polyolefins. And we want to do it quickly because the problem that we have right now with microplastics, et cetera, is here right now. So one of the challenges that we have in trying to find alternatives is that the materials that we design or that we choose have to function exactly in the same way as polyolefins and these massive pieces of equipment that are already in place. And really what determines whether these materials will behave well in film blowers or extruders, et cetera, are the rheological properties of the polymers. In addition to surface properties, adhesion, et cetera, but the rheology is really what ultimately determines whether this is going to work or not. So some of the quantities that a rheology will measure is, for example, the stress response of a material as a function of time, the viscosity as a function of time. This is representative of the curves that one measures. There's a viscosity at different Weisenberg numbers, different rates of deformation, basically, as a function of time. And what matters here is the scale that you see over here. So for this particular material, I think this polypropylene, or let's assume it is polypropylene, you need to be able to describe the rheology over multiple decades of time. So you start to think about models. You are going to need models that allow you to describe anything from nanoseconds to hundreds of seconds to minutes to hours in some cases. And for that, you need to turn to multi-scale models. So that's really what this conversation today is about. How do we come up with these multi-scale models for these classes of materials? And at the end of the day, we want to predict, we want to design new systems. So how do we do that? So I'll give you 3 vignettes today about different parts of the problem. The first one has to do with the design of new molecules, the discovery of new molecules using ML-based methods. That's in its infancy, but there's already some signs that this is going to be productive. I will tell you about how we go from those atomistic level models to multi-scale models that allow us to cover rheology. And I'll show you examples of how you can use those models to do better experiments. Aziza, how are you? We just hired Aziza as a new assistant professor at Anyway. And Juanita is I'm sorry, I have to acknowledge my new team. And they come from MIT. How cool is that? I'm sorry, I'm distracted. I'm touched. So I'll show you how we use these models to come up with new ways of measuring rheology faster in a high-throughput manner. And then finally, I'll tell you a little bit about redesigning monomers that you can actually break switches that you put in traditional polymers, and how we try to understand the chemistry of how those bonds break so that we can make predictions as to what's going to behave well and what's not. All right, so the first piece has to do with AI-based design of polymer molecules. I would like to have an AI system to which I ask, please give me a polymer with this viscosity, this density, this, et cetera, and get an answer. And half of you, during the question session, would ask me, why don't you just use an LLM to do that? And we've tried, and it's not working yet. So I'll show you a few examples of the things that do not work still with LLMs for these types of applications. So in here, we see extracts from a recent paper in which, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go here because, in which we're trying to describe molecules using a variety of languages, for example, smiles, strings, and we'd like to predict applications, right, or properties. And the gist of this paper is that none of these methods work. The property predictions are very poor. The language translations do not work. And here we see an example in which, for example, where the task is to convert a smile string, so that's a symbol letter description of a polymeric molecule. We're trying to convert that into the actual IUPAC name of the molecule. So the name of the molecule is shown here. That's the smile string that you put in. And then the output of GPT-4 is that. It's a completely different molecule. So here we see another example. You want to go from IUPAC to the actual chemical formula. That's the IUPAC. That's the truth. That's the output. And again, it is wrong. This is an analysis of different GPT-like engines in these different tasks. And this is the success rate, and it's dismal. You see that we're not there yet with these methods. Part of it is a lot of the data are not available. So we tried something else. We found a data set that we could download from the web, et cetera, and train some and refine some of these models for specific tasks. The task that we had in mind was, can you convert a polymer smiles into a polymer name or a polymer name into a smiles? And again, in here you see the rates of accuracy of different models. If these models worked, all of these bars would be 100%. For most of what we want to do, it's 50% success rate. So we are not there yet. At the rate we're going, perhaps in a year or two, we're close to 100%. Right now, we're not. So we decided to take a different approach. And what we did was actually inspired by work that was done here at MIT. So the idea was to use a variational autoencoder to actually digitize the formula of the molecules, encode the properties in a latent space, and then generate new molecules that will have the properties that we want the system to have. So let me tell you how that works. First of all, the reason that for polymers this is complicated is summarized here. We have autoencoders that actually work for small molecules. This is a paper here by Alain and Bombarelli's group some time ago, where they can autoencode the properties of small molecules. This is a very nice paper by a group here at MIT, Giacola and, okay, I'm forgetting, but there you go, Barzinet, thank you, on how to encode these molecules into graphs. And again, it works very nicely for small molecules. But what we want to do is for polymers. And polymers are not just one molecule. You have distributions of molecules, and you need to capture all of this architecture in what you do. So we started by thinking that what we do could be a lot better if we incorporated some of the chemistry that we already know into the descriptions that Giacola and co-workers had proposed. That's what we do in chemical engineering, right? We use group contribution methods, for example, to come up with correlations. We've done it for almost 100 years. So we came up with a library of functional motifs that we use to describe molecules. That's what you use with UNIFAC or all of these group contribution methods. And we incorporated these motif graphs into the algorithms that were already available from various groups. So we encode information at two levels, at the atom graphs, atoms and bonds, and then at the functional group level. And we use a multi-layer perceptron for hierarchical connections between these two levels of description. Okay? So the first question that we ask is, can you really use this formalism to describe complicated molecules, more complicated than small little molecules? So here, that's what we're asking. If the target molecule that we have is one of these, shown on the left, and we use this new autoencoder to just capture the architecture of the molecule, can we get it back? And we compare what you get with this hierarchical network to what you get with just smiles or just atom graphs. And you see that when you use ours, this hierarchical approach, you can actually recreate almost all of the structures of the molecules. Whereas with the previous approaches, trained on very limited data sets, and granted, you only get about a 50 to 60% accuracy. So already this idea, very simple, of putting in what we knew from before helps you create molecules with close to 95% accuracy. And of course, you start to recognize chemistry because you have the functional groups already embedded in the description. Okay? Once you have that, you start to embed the properties of the system using a simple global pooling and self-attention. And you get to the point of having to train your model. So this is a project that we did with 3M, in which we're trying to create new adhesive polymers based on acrylates. Acrylates are toxic, they want to replace those. So we had to first come up with a database on which to train the autoencoders. And what is amazing about this type of work now is that when you don't have the data, you can actually generate libraries with hundreds of entries using simple simulations with simple force fields. It goes very quickly, and those force fields have become so good that when you compare properties to experimental measurements, they really agree with each other. You can train them. So we do have a database, and you can actually create those databases for any family of molecules that you want at this point. All right, and then we see how well these VAEs work for our purposes. So what you see here are predictions compared to actual measurements or simulations for hundreds of molecules, for density, cohesive energy density, which matters for adhesion, glass transition temperatures, etc. And what you see is that in all cases, the predictions are very good. They're very, very reasonable, much better than what we could get with group contribution methods, and comparable to what you can get with simulations. And now the question becomes, this is just prediction, can we actually design new molecules with target properties? Can we invert the process? And the answer is yes. In here, for example, we're asking these algorithms to design molecules that have a very high cohesive energy density. So some of these are new designs. And then when you go ahead and do simulations or experiments to actually measure the properties, they agree with each other. This is not very difficult. Cohesive energy density, you can already tell what's going to happen on the basis of hydrogen bonds, etc. But there's other properties that are really, really difficult to understand, like glass transition temperatures. Glass transition temperatures involves packing, interactions, densities, symmetries. And again, in here, you ask the algorithms to design new molecules with either very high or very low glass transitions, and these algorithms find them. So it's proving to be very useful. We've discovered some really interesting new glass formers using these algorithms, whose physics seem to be different from what we had seen before. So already interesting science to be done on the basis of these discoveries. All right. So these are small molecules. Now we're going to go to polymers. And when we started this work, again, the question that we had is this ever going to work? Right? The moment that you have a polymer, you can arrange your monomers in an infinite number of ways. So how many data points for different sequences am I going to need to ever train these models to predict and generate new properties? So before jumping into the project, we defined a simple toy model. We said, let's assume that we only have 4 monomers to work with. We have 2 colors, 2 flavors for the backbone, and then 2 flavors for the branches or the side groups. And then we can arrange these 4 in any number of combinations using these 10 different building blocks. So that's the chemical library to which we have access in this toy model. And the question is, how many different sequences do I need to train an algorithm to be able to predict the properties of the systems and generate new designs with target properties? Much smaller than the real life problem that we're facing. And if the answer is a few hundred, we can proceed. If the answer is tens of thousands, then we were not going to pursue this project. So we generated a library with 1,500 unique polymers, and the task was to predict the radius of gyration, which is what matters for diffusion and viscosity. We did simulations, but you could have done this with, or you could do this conceivably with robots, with machines that synthesize molecules and move just as fast as with calculations. And then here you see the results. You find that after training your algorithms with just about 300 to 400 different sequences, it doesn't get any better. So a really tiny library of 400 different sequences is sufficient to train the algorithms. And of course, the number of combinations that you can have is almost infinite. So this is what gave us faith that this is worthwhile, and let's now do the serious work of creating the data sets and the measurements to do real polymers. Okay, same as before, here we're demonstrated that we can actually capture the properties. You want to use this for design. So again, you invert these algorithms and you ask algorithm, can you please design sequences that have this target radius of gyration, 2,000 in this case, which is outside the range of what was used to train the algorithms. Every blue point that you see over here is a new design, and almost all of them hit the target. And some of them are interesting, not things that you could have imagined before. This one, for example, gives you the correct radius of gyration because it falls in this very interesting way that would have been difficult to imagine. So this is turning out to be useful for design of a sequence. Okay, so this work now continues. Now it starts to get boring because we're just repeating everything with more and more sequences, more molecules, more flavors. We're training the data sets. And we're looking at specific families. For example, with Apple, we're looking at the polymers for their casings. They have to have certain properties, and you can do this with these algorithms for the families of materials that they're interested in, which we're not allowed to share, but you get the idea of how this goes. Okay, so that's just the sequence. Those are simple properties like heat capacities, glass transitions, things of that nature. But I said at the beginning that what really matters is the rheology, these 10 decades. So how do we do that? And that's a lot more challenging. So we're going to have to first coarse-grain the representation. We cannot use atoms anymore. We're going to use superatoms to describe these molecules. We're going to go to this level of representation. And as you will see in a moment, that's not enough. We will have to go to yet another level of representation in a few minutes. So the idea here is very simple. This is something that we've been doing for decades in statistical mechanics. We simply reduce the representation of a molecule from many atoms to groups of atoms. And we can reduce it as much as we can. We we dial in the level of coarse graining that we have. We can automate all of that. And we do it to the point that we retain just enough of the physics that are relevant before we lose the information that we want to predict the properties that we want. All right? So again, that can be done with automatic algorithms. So once you do that, you start to calculate the response of a material. In this case, we have polystyrene, for example, over several decades of time. So this is the mean square displacement. This is what you use for diffusion of a molecule. And this is the stress as a function of time. In red, you see the results of atomistic simulations. In blue, you see the results of these coarse-grained simulations. And you immediately see that the slopes are more or less the same, but the absolute values are shifted. And the reason, of course, is not too hard to understand. The moment that you lose all of the hydrogen atoms, et cetera, in your representation, you don't have the locking in mechanisms to slow the dynamics. Things can slide past each other, and molecules are moving a lot faster on average. But the physics are the same. The slope is the same. So what you do, once you have these two results, is you simply take the blue curve and you shift it until it overlaps with the red curve. That's what you do in what is called time-temperature superposition. With experiments, we're not doing anything different. And you do the same thing for the stress. And you remember your shift factors. And those are numbers that come from predictions from these calculations. All right. The moment you do that, you've gained a little bit of time here, maybe 1 or 2 decades. So not enough to go to the experimental level. So given that I've only gained 2 decades, I need to do something else. So we go to this level of representation. And what we're going to do here is fundamentally different from what we were doing with these coarse particles. The basic physics that we want to retain at this level of representation is the fact that these giant polymeric molecules are entangled with each other. It's like a giant ball of spaghetti. And those constraints do not allow you to move in any way you want. You need to slither past the system. And one way of retaining those physics is by putting in these slip springs, we call them, that connect pairs of molecules. So the moment that you have one of these restrictions connecting these two molecules, they cannot go anywhere they want. They're restricted in the way they move. Now, slip springs are going to have a series of really interesting properties. First of all, they do not affect in any way the equilibrium thermodynamic properties of the material. They're invisible to those properties. They only affect the dynamics. Secondly, these slip springs are allowed to slide along the molecules. Whenever they get to an end, they disappear. And then, regulated by a chemical potential, they appear at random somewhere else. So they're always fluctuating. They're always moving in the system. It's not the rules of motion, what determines how they come in, the length of the springs, the stresses. That is actually based on very serious kinetic theory arguments. So you can connect all of those properties to fundamental physics and to the present representations of the molecules that we had at higher levels of description. So how do I say this? Nothing's coming out of thin air. There's a method to all of that, okay? What you saw in this movie over here were, okay, it's not playing, were slip springs along one molecule that are moving along, and when they get to the end, they disappear, and then at a time later, somebody shows up here and connects to a different molecule. All right. So once you have these models, you do the same thing again. You run the coarse-grained simulation that we had from before, and now the slip spring simulation that we have here, and you overlap them with each other, and you get a shift factor. And you do the same thing for the stress. Now we've gained many, many decades in time. So now I have access to timescales that are way longer than what I had before. And the question becomes, are these extrapolations going to work? So once you put all your data together, you can create these master curves. So here you see the stress as a function of time for polystyrene, different degrees of polymerization. At the shortest timescales, very fast motions, the atomistic representation is shown in red. Then you go to the coarse grain, shown in yellow. Then you go to the slip spring, shown in blue or in green. And they all overlap with each other, they match with each other, and you reconstructed the entire relaxation curve for the system over, in this case, 7 decades of time. That's the problem that we were trying to solve. So at least we have a model that allows us to go back and forth between the two. Once you get these curves, you can integrate them and get the viscosity. And you can start making comparisons to experiments. So this is data. Experiments are these red symbols for polystyrene. And then the lines are fits to this theory and the predictions, and they seem to agree with each other. There's more data for different tacticities of polystyrene, different experiments by different groups. And you see that in general, the predictions and the experiments agree with each other. Now, this is all data that you have to find in the literature, so you not always have all of the characterization of the samples. You don't really know what the polydispersity is. But the fact that, for the most part, the points for the experiments and the calculations are on the same plot is very, very encouraging. All right, so the moment that you start to analyze the data a little bit more carefully, and you look at these relaxation curves in great detail, you start to see some discrepancies. Again, the lines are simulations, the points are experimental data, and in particular, over here, you see that the agreement is not all that great. So after a lot of thinking, we started to think that the origin of these discrepancies had to do with the polydispersity of the samples. In all of the calculations that I'm showing you, all molecules have the same size. And of course, in experiments, that is not the case. So we went back to the drawing board. We incorporated all of these polydispersities very precisely. Every molecule in the system has a different size, wide distributions, et cetera. And when you do that very careful work, you can actually achieve fantastic agreement with experiments. It's quantitative, both for the complex and relaxation modulus, for the viscosity, for the molecular weight, and for elongation or shear flows. So we're very happy with how this works now. So these are existing polymers. Can we now start designing new materials? So we're going to fast forward a little bit and just show you the results of a process that took about a year with 3M. We wanted to discover a new adhesive that would actually replace some of what they use now. They had a set of properties. And this process of molecular design and rheology, et cetera, led us to this molecule that you have over here, this polyethylhexyl acrylate. It is not as toxic as the acrylates that are used right now. Still toxic, but not as bad. But the properties are actually very good. So we had to engineer the molecular weight distribution that we needed to achieve exactly the rheology that we wanted. This was the result at the end of several iterations. And then in here, you see the rheology. That's what they wanted to have, and that's what this design gave them. The lines are, okay, the lines are simulations, and the points are the experiments. So this seems to work. So we're excited that finally we have something that works for these types of systems. The designs that we're coming up with are primitive, and they take a lot of work. Primitive in that we have homopolymers. We're not looking at blends. Our ability to predict the effect of additives, et cetera, is very, very limited. So a lot of work has to be done. But for a homopolymer that sort of works, we can now do something that's useful and relevant. And again, things are only going to get better with these approaches. Okay, now I wanted to show this slide because it is a plug for a collaboration that we have with the Olsen group. And I've been meeting with a lot of Olsen students at lunch. And I wanted to remind them that the work that you're doing is super important and really useful for the polymer community. And one of the things that this work makes clear is that when you describe these materials using a smile string, et cetera, you also need to provide measures of the molecular weight distribution, the degree of branching, all of that stuff. And with the methods that we've been developing with Brad and his group, you can now do that, right? So the description is not just this sequence of letters. It is a sequence of letters and a type of distribution, a type of chemistry that allows you to actually generate the ensembles that you need when you describe the data in a database. So a really important step forward, thanks to that partnership that we have with them. Okay. Now, the biggest challenge that we face in all this work is generating new data for new polymeric materials. And anybody who's measured a viscosity or a rheology curve, et cetera, for a polymer knows that it is a very painful process. They make very big samples. Sometimes they cut it in this dog bone shape, and they walk it to a huge instrument this size that destroys the sample, and you do it again and again and again. And we need to do it about 10,000 times to generate this data. So the problem is a bit intractable, right? So how do you automate all of that? So one idea, and again, this is a plug to my friend Professor McKinley here, is to think of different ways of measuring rheology in a high throughput manner. This example, they have something that they call CABR, capillary extensional rheology, where they take a polymer sample and they just, a little drop, they separate it. It forms a filament. The filament thins as a function of time as you separate the two surfaces that hold the drop until it breaks. And from the variation of the diameter of this film as a function of time, they can back out the rheology. Of course, if you have a good model to describe this rheology, you can extract many more properties than if you have a bad model. So can we use these slip spring methods to do that? And of course, if this works, you can have many, many, many droplets and just take video of all of the different materials and extract rheology. Another way of doing it by a different group, that would be Greg McKenna, would be to have these thin films of polymer that he puts on the top of holes. These are nano bubbles. He blows air from the bottom. You form this little bubble, and you measure the change in curvature as a function of time for a given pressure, and you back out the rheology. Again, high throughput, because each of these can be a different sample. But you need a model that tells you what the polymer is doing to extract the rheology. So one of the things that we've done is generalize these models to interfaces and surfaces. So now the slip springs are also living on the, okay. So these were super cool movies where you see the entanglements coming out and coming in, and it is just fascinating. Oh, sure. They're not that great. I was lying, all right. So, okay, yeah, everybody goes, whoa. So we can do these calculations with the springs, compare them to brutal, very painful atomistic simulations, verify that these models work. And having verified that, you can now use these models to interpret the results of these bubble experiments or thin film experiments for characterization. So again, maybe with these combinations of tools, we will be able to come up with high throughput methods to do these things a lot better. All right. So the third thing that I wanted to tell you about is a little bit different now, and a different aspect of how one uses AI and machine learning to design new materials. So in this case, what we're trying to do is sort of give up and say, look, polyolefins are so great that we're not going to be able to move away from them. But what we can do is maybe take a polyethylene and somewhere in the middle insert these little switchers here that actually break when you heat the polymer up, or when you put acid, or when you put an enzyme, or when you put water. So you can use AI if you want to tell you what designs would work, or you can do something better, which is walk next door to your colleague Stuart Rowan and ask him, hey, Stuart, what designs are going to work for this? And he gives you a multitude of molecules that you can put in polyethylene. He would like to test them. He can make them. And the question is, how is the polymer going to behave? So these are candidates that we're all looking at. Using simple models, you start to design or to measure things like density, melting temperatures, crystallization, viscosities, etc. And what you find is that these switches that you put in here, they actually can alter the rheology in major ways. They serve as hinges that you're putting in. The flexibility of the molecule changes dramatically, and the properties are completely different. And perhaps more importantly, what you find is that the moment that you start shearing or putting the system in extensional viscometers, they start to degrade. The molecular weight goes down very, very quickly. So you really want to engineer switches that have the right mechanical strength, the right torsional barriers, and that are susceptible to very specific temperature ranges or pH ranges, because otherwise they just degrade very, very easily. So the moment that I say degrade, I have a problem, because all of the models that I'm using are classical. They cannot capture chemistry, chemical reactions, bond breaking, or bond formation. So we need to use something better than that. And of course, there's DFT or quantum mechanics, which you can use to describe these processes, but it is very, very expensive. And one very good thing that's happened over the last several years has been the advent of these machine-learned interatomic potentials. So the basic idea here is very simple. Let's just do a few DFT calculations for a system of interest, calculate all the energies, all of the bond lengths, distances, torsional barriers. And then let's train a machine learning algorithm, a neural network, on the energies that I calculate. So in a sense, what you're doing is fitting all of these energies with a neural network that would allow you, hopefully, to describe all of the interactions between the system, many body interactions in this case, including bond formation, bond breaking, and chemical reactions of any sort. So we've been experimenting with these methods and apply them to a number of systems. For example, chemical reactions on catalysts, where now you can do elevated temperatures, you can take into account entropy, we've been looking at water autoionization or lithium transport in batteries at interfaces. And in all of these cases, it seems to work. One of the challenges here is that in many instances, these force fields are unstable. And the reason they're unstable is that during a simple simulation, you don't expose them to these artificial, difficult conditions that would arise when you're about to break a bond, for example. So you need to come up with strategies that allow you to explore those regions to train the force field. And that's what we've been doing. So we've developed software. That's the software. You can look for something called bisages and methods that allow you to bias simulations in the ways that are most productive when you're trying to fit these force fields. It does it automatically. So by the end of the day, you capture all of the energy space and configuration space that is relevant to the process that you're trying to investigate. So that's really what we do here. Then another useful thing that we have done is for those of you who have used these force fields, is that the memory requirements are massive. You need to have very fancy GPUs to do these calculations. And as fast as they are, these simulations are about 1,000 times slower than a simple classical force field. So very, very demanding. So we've come up with ways that allow you to combine multiple expansions for long-range interactions and then machine-learned force fields for short-range interactions. And with that, you really can reduce the memory requirements, go a lot faster, and use this finally for real-life polymer simulations. So that's what we've been doing for all of these chemistries that I've shown you before. We start training the models using approximate force fields. We do the quantum mechanics. We train a network. We do a bias simulation. We do the DFT once again. We train the force field. We get it better, better, better. You do many iterations. And at the end, you have something that you hope works. So I'll just show you a little result for polyethylene, where we show that we can capture the energies at which these bonds break when you stretch it. We have results for all of the chemistries that I showed you before, so we're happy about that. And again, the important thing is that now I can put this in my many-body simulation, far from equilibrium, and start to explore how these molecules are going to break or not, or reform when you put them in a rheometer, which is what we wanted to do. So again, this is just the beginning. We're creating the libraries of force fields. We're creating the libraries of monomers that work, and the synthesis of the systems is now underway to see what we can come up with. So that is really what I wanted to tell you. I want to thank my students once again. Thank you for inviting me, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Yeah.
Wait for the mic.
Thank you very much. I was curious about your multi-scale modeling. So when we look at rheology, we can look at things that kind of move on like a fairly large distance scale. But what about dynamics that happen at a much smaller atomic scale? Are there ways to model those over very long decades of time?
Yeah, so those dynamics at very, very fast timescales, I lose when I go to the higher order descriptions. They're just not there. And if you try to use those models to recreate the dynamics that happen at very fast deformations, for example, they don't work. They were not designed for that. These methods only work when you put them right on top of each other and you use them collectively.
And what about dynamics that are very slow but very small on a length scale?
Very slow, but very small on that scale. I don't know. I feel like that's a trick question. Let me think. What's very slow but happens on a very small length scale? Well, maybe an example would be a chemical reaction that breaks one of these bonds, but for which the energy barrier is very high, right? So again, as long as I can calculate that energy barrier, capture it, and then explain the process, I will be able to describe those.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I guess first, practical question. So you mentioned the challenge of microplastics. Of course, we hear a lot about PFAS. What are the chances of replacing or finding some more sustainable alternatives to fluoropolymers like PTFE? Is that something you're working on?
Yeah, so that's this project.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So
And on that note, how easy is it to simulate? Because I know those polymers have very hierarchical, like fibril structures that are, go out to all kinds of large length scales. It seems difficult to maybe handle with this
in
approach.
solution, it is very difficult, but in the melt, they don't form those structures. And that's exactly what Apple is trying to do. And we found some polymers that work great. And the challenge that we're having is that the interfacial characteristics of those polymers are lousy.
Yeah, that's actually what I was going to say, is that what we actually care most about there often is the interfacial property.
Yeah.
And maybe on that note, what are the prospects for going even further to looking at, for example, in like solution, looking at effects of pH and charge? There's a lot of kind of levels of complexity even in the modeling that I think today are still quite difficult.
Yeah, you need to put them in. Absolutely.
Okay.
But already on these polymers and the fluoropolymers with Apple, we're seeing some designs that are promising. By using additives, they can bring up the interfacial properties to what they want. The problem that we have right now is that over time, you lose some of those additives and the properties start to degrade. But there are already materials conceived in this manner that are pretty good candidates. And then as a matter of a funny story, one of their preferred tests for the interfacial properties is what they call the sunscreen test. So they take the plastics and they put 10 different types of sunscreen on them, and then they watch it dissolve. And that's how they determine whether this is going to be a good phone or not. It's amazing at Apple. And I need to tell you this, the worst, most aggressive sunscreen, the one that you should not put near your phone, is banana boat. That eats up your, if you pass the banana boat test, that's it. You have a good material.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah.
So thank you for a lovely overview of many different scales here. Could you talk a little bit about topology? Particularly, most of the examples you showed were linear chains, but I could take a chain of a given molecular weight and I could make it maybe branched. And it'll have very different adhesive properties, for example. So
Yeah.
Smiles can handle that kind of topology. Can the codes learn that? Because particularly slip links, it can't really tell where the links are.
They cannot, and the moment that the branching gets a little bit too large or not too small, that's a problem. And again, something that we're investigating right now. It's very, very hard because the branching is often separated by long distances. So it is just painful to generate the data to fit the slip string model. So,
But in principle, it's just time and
it's
numbers
time
of
and
simulations.
size and effort. Yeah. I don't think the methods are going to fail us. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. Could you talk a little bit about the challenges, opportunities, any work you've done on incorporating sustainability metrics into the simulations and models? So sustainability of the synthetic process itself, life cycle assessment, human toxicity, social factors, et cetera.
Yeah. So we have done absolutely nothing to. No, I have to be honest. We're not looking at that. I think we want to make sure that we have the tools and the methods to be able to design. That's what we're good at. And others, I know in some of our teams that we are looking at those aspects, but we're not doing that. Yeah, sorry to disappoint you.
Other questions? Yeah.
So in the last part, you're using machine learning, machine learning to train the force field from the AIMD. So I wonder, in those cases, if the AIMD can, for example, the training data, if they cannot, sometimes they cannot predicting the bound break accurate, then would that be happen like you train on the not, for example, the AIMD did not work with the experiment data, then if we just train on AIMD, would it lead to some problem for the downstream tasks?
It is a problem, and all of this is approximate. So these models, the machine learned models, are going to be just as good as the data that we used to train them. They will only be able to reproduce the cases that they've already seen. So that's why it is so important when you're training them to identify collective variables that can describe the processes that are relevant. And that's very, very challenging. And then that's also why it is important to use biasing methods that sample all of those collective variables. And again, that's very demanding. And without those, we've made many mistakes before. So that's why we use those approaches now. Yeah.
Any last questions? All right, last one.
On the multi-scale model, it's very fascinating to me that smoothing the molecule out works like increasing the temperature, right? Because you are using sort of time temperature superposition to shift the curve. Before you were mentioning the fact that you were like eliminating the hydrogen atoms, but could you like elaborate more on that? Like why does it work like increasing temperature, smoothing the molecule out?
Well, if you just look at those curves, the coarse-grained and the atomistic, you see that the shape is the same, but the absolute value is different. So the fact that the shape, that the slope is the same, is telling you that you're in the same regime of diffusion. That is, the physics are not changing too much. If I actually coarse-grained my polymer into a ball for those timescales, I would be in a different regime. It would be linear diffusion, and I would have lost the physics of the polymer. So there's a bit of trial and error where you want to coarse grain just enough to go very fast, but not too much to lose the relevant physics. And that requires some intervention. Yeah, it's not perfect.
Thank you.
Juan, on behalf of the Department of Chemical Engineering, I'll thank you first for spending the past 2 days with us. Actually, I'll thank you first for a wonderful presentation. Next, for spending the past 2 days for us. And then for...
Presentation.
Presentations.
I was going to say, which one did you not like?
Presentations.
So I don't do that talk again.
But also for your engagement with our department, and that includes your friendship with members of our community, your collaborations, and your employment of our trainees. So
You keep sending them.
we will do our best, and you keep hiring them. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Krista. I was showing the price tag. $13. Walgreens. Thank you.
told you he'd be entertaining.
Yeah, thank you.